there's really a nexus between three things. One is being very liberal. The other is being LGBT, and the third thing is high anxiety or sadness. So people who say they are anxious or depressed all or most of the time. I mean, there was a piece out in the Atlantic which I think showed that something like 3/4 of LGBT teens reported feeling sad or hopeless all or most of the time. It's like 3/4. Now, there was, of course, a pandemic effect. That pandemic effect hit all categories. Yes, it affected LGBT and the most women, but it had a uniform impact across all categories, but it's just that LGBT were already quite a margin higher on the anxiety and depression scale, and they simply went even higher. So, it was like upwards of 3/4 reporting feeling sad or hopeless almost all the time as of 2021. So just astounding numbers. So there really is this kind of mental health crisis, but it's concentrated again in particular in the LGBT group, in the very liberal group. And so there's this kind of connection. And what I found was if you did a factor analysis of three variables, one being the anxiety and sadness scale, the other being the ideology from very liberal to very conservative, and the third one being LGBT or not LGBT, that you saw one underlying variable explaining roughly half the variation in those three. So that's suggesting there's a lot of overlap there. And again, I think it relates back to these psychological dispositions, which predict all three.
Yeah. So there's like, 4 different theories, right? There's LGBT makes you liberal and makes you sad. Being sad makes you liberal and LGBT. Being liberal makes you sad and LGBT. Maybe that one's a little harder to buy. And then there's they're all related to something else in the universe, which is, that could be a lot of different things. It seems like, to an extent, sort of, liberalism, has been taken over by identity politics. Are the mentally unhealthy just sort of another identity group? Because you do have sort of, the recognition under like the American with Disabilities Act. You do like have this bureaucratic thing where like mental illness is recognized. When I was teaching students, I don't know if you have this in the UK, but some of them will get extra time on their test. They'll get like, everyone will get like 50 minutes. They'll have some subjective disorder that will give them like 3 hours or something.
Right.
And, they get and there's like, there's data like in like higher class areas, like everyone is getting this exemption. It's
right.
It's a crazy thing. And, people don't usually, I don't think they just lie about these things. I think people will, if it's in their interest, they'll convince themselves they're mentally ill, or they'll have some predisposition that they can be encouraged into sort of indulging in. But yeah, I think the mental illness, I think, is the most fundamental thing, because it's more, it's more tied to your identity than your politics. Probably more than LGBT, even though that's more fundamental than politics to people, because it does, like, one of the lessons here is that it is sort of like a trendy thing. So yeah, I said a lot there, but go ahead.
You have like, the correlation between anxiety and depression is highest with LGBT, next highest with women, and least, let's say, it seems to be least amongst non-whites. Now, there was a study that went back to, I think, has data for quite a large number of high school students, quite a significant sample going back to like 2010 or 2008, and shows that the gap between LGBT and the others on these measures increases between like 2012 and 2017-18, something like in that period. And that's kind of strange, because that's a period in which, we've got constantly growing toleration of LGBT lifestyles. And so it's kind of counterintuitive that, you would have thought the mental health problem would have been greater back when there was more homophobia, let's say. But actually, it seems like the reverse, because a lot of these papers kind of assume that the reason that there's a bigger problem with anxiety and depression and unhappiness in the LGBT group is because of discrimination and psychological load and all these sorts of problems associated with prejudice. Now, of course, it could be that there's more attention being paid in the culture to prejudice, which simply makes those issues more present in their minds on a daily basis. So there are a whole bunch of different things that could be happening. I can't help but think that a culture which, let's say, valorizes vulnerability, that talks a lot about trauma and about, encouraging people to sort of explore their feelings, explore their traumas, is one in which you're perhaps going to get more focus on these things. I mean, again, that's just a theory, and I mean, it's not a theory that I've seen well worked out in a lot of literature, but it's also a theory that's kind of going to be very unfashionable. As I said, this is not my area, and it's not an area I intend to go into, but I just think it would be interesting to understand, because you have cultures where, for example, in native cultures in sort of the Arctic, for example, you have extremely high suicide rates. Now, there is a degree to which that is cultural. There's a degree to which, in the South Pacific, you had copycat suicide phenomena. So, to what extent is mental illness also susceptible to contagion effects, to cultural effects? I think that would be an interesting area, and it could just be I'm ignorant of the literature, but I think there's something going on culturally that is explaining this rise. Not and now, of course, it's social media. By the way, I should say, social media use is correlated with all these things as well, with being very liberal, with being LGBT, and it is so. So we do have that correlation. However, it only explains a portion of the nexus between these variables, and it also, it's also linked to mental health. So it is a part of the story, but I found it only explaining like maybe 10% of the variation. So it's not the main culprit.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one problem with the mental health discourse is like it assumes that you can raise awareness of mental. It's like, if it's like in quantum mechanics, it's like when you observe the thing, you change sort of the nature of what's going on, right?
Right.
And it's like there's this hubris that you could observe mental illness, raise awareness of it, think about it, talk about it, and not change it, right? But it's like, this is something that's fundamental. It's like not like the physical world where you're observing the clouds and the way they move, and that's just the observer doesn't matter. Once you start talking about it, once you have a language for it, once you label it, you're changing how people think about these things and how they experience it. Maybe it makes it better, maybe it makes it worse. But the idea that you're just a scientist observing things and you're not going to have like an influence, that is just, that's just a completely unjustified assumption. And
Yeah.
so I think, it's a plausible hypothesis that by thinking about this stuff, by raising awareness, by putting so much, it was like I think it was just Obamacare when like insurers became required to cover. I know they became required to cover like drug treatment. Mental health. I don't know if that's always recovered, but there's a trend towards making it more readily available. And it's not like everything doesn't stay constant. Things change once you start talking and thinking about it. And whether we're doing it in a healthy way, it's not something, where we're really investigating, because the system as a whole doesn't have any incentive to do that.